The story begins with a question that haunts even the cleverest minds. What happens when guilt disappears? When a celebrated psychiatrist teaching moral freedom turns up dead, Nero Wolfe is dragged from his brownstone comfort into a web of conscience, corruption, and cold ambition. From glittering studios to grim confession, every suspect hides behind intellect, and every truth leaves a bruise. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. If the morning hadn't started with Fritz's popovers and Wolfe's usual grunt of approval, I might have missed the warning signs. The man was halfway through his second cup of coffee when he dropped the bomb. "Archie," he said, wiping his lips with the deliberation of a man signing a peace treaty, "I shall require your presence this afternoon. We are leaving the house." Leaving. The word clanged like a broken bell. I set my fork down. Leaving as in going out, of doors. "Precisely," he said. "A lecture. Moral psychology in criminal motives." Fritz froze, ladle in midair. I swear, if he'd dropped it, the shock might have killed us both. Wolfe going to a public lecture was like the Statue of Liberty hailing a cab. I told him so, and he only muttered, "Even the sedentary intellect must occasionally verify its inferiors." It was going to be one of those days. By 2 o'clock, we were in a yellow cab heading uptown, which was as close to the apocalypse as I cared to get. Wolfe sat beside me, vast and disapproving of everything from the driver's cough to the sunlight. "Traffic is a perversion," he grumbled. "Yeah," I said. "So is you leaving the brownstone." He closed his eyes, maybe praying for patience. I kept mine open, just in case the cab got hit by lightning, which would have been fitting. Every red light added a fresh layer of disbelief. Wolfe's idea of outdoor activity was the walk from his chair to the orchid room. When we finally stopped outside the university, I paid the fare. Wolfe's expression made it clear he considered the tip an affront to civilization, and we stepped into daylight. Somewhere, I figured, the city's crime rate had just risen. Wolfe was out in public. Something bad was bound to follow. The lecture hall was packed tight enough to make Wolfe twitch. The speaker, Dr. Gerald Miles, stood at the podium like a man convinced the world needed him. His topic, moral psychology and criminal motives, promised enlightenment but delivered narcotic effect. He had the kind of voice that wrapped sin in silk. According to Miles, guilt was a socially conditioned relic, and true intellects should rise above it. Wolfe sat there like a mountain range in a chair, lips pursed. I let my eyes wander. Students, socialites, the kind of crowd that likes the sound of its own conscience. One woman in the front row scribbled notes furiously, and I caught a whiff of expensive perfume and ambition. Miles's argument grew slicker with each word. Criminals weren't wicked. They were liberated from guilt. Wolfe's fingers drummed on the armrest like they were measuring the patience of the universe. When Miles compared guilt to spiritual arthritis, Wolfe let out a low growl. I started timing how long he'd last before detonating. It wasn't going to be long. The first crack came from a woman near the aisle, a lean brunette with eyes like polished steel, and the voice of a woman who didn't mind drawing blood in public. "Dr. Miles," she said, standing up, "if guilt is obsolete, what's your replacement?" "Vanity." A ripple went through the room. Miles smiled, too smooth to sweat. "Ah, Miss Vance, always the contrarian." So that was Caroline Vance, the columnist known for cutting reputations into ribbons. I'd read her work, half wit, half switchblade. She pressed on. "If your theories let criminals sleep well, do their victims thank you for the philosophy?" The audience was hooked. Miles countered with charm and jargon, talking about moral evolution. Wolfe muttered something under his breath that sounded like Latin profanity. I admit I enjoyed it. Watching someone puncture Miles's smug balloon was more fun than the talk itself. Caroline had him cornered, until Wolfe decided to take the knife. When Wolfe spoke, the hall went quiet. His voice rolled out deep and deliberate. "Doctor," he said, "your theory commits an error both intellectual and moral. You mistake the absence of guilt for strength. It is decay." Miles blinked, clearly unused to being challenged by an overgrown philosopher in pinstripes. "Sir, are you suggesting guilt serves a purpose?" Wolfe's brows rose. "It is the guardian of civilization. Remove guilt, and you remove the check upon appetite." The audience leaned in. Miles tried to laugh it off. "I hardly think civilization requires guilt to survive." "Evidently," Wolfe said, "you've never dined with a man unburdened by it." That one landed. Laughter broke the tension, but it wasn't friendly laughter. Miles flushed. I could practically see his ego spring a leak. Wolfe folded his arms, satisfied, while I made a note to buy tomorrow's paper. Public debates involving Nero Wolfe tended to make front-page copy, and sometimes morgue headlines. While Wolfe was dismantling moral philosophy, I spotted someone more interesting in the back row. A tall, pale fellow, with a limp and the kind of face you don't forget. His suit was expensive, but his expression wasn't. He didn't clap. He didn't smirk. He just watched Wolfe with eyes so cold they could have chilled the beer back home. When the lecture ended, he slipped out before the applause started. I don't claim psychic powers, but if trouble ever wore a face, it was that one. Wolfe didn't notice him, too busy glaring at Miles. Still, something about that man's quiet exit itched under my collar. And if there's one thing I've learned working for Wolfe, it's that an itch like that usually means you're about to scratch up a corpse. We rode back downtown in near silence. Wolfe stared out the window, frowning as if the skyline had offended him. Finally, he said, "A man without guilt, Archie, is the most dangerous creature on earth." I whistled. "Meaning Dr. Miles or that frozen-faced spectator in the back?" "Both," Wolfe replied, "but one of them will prove it." He closed his eyes then, sinking into that post-debate sulk of his. I didn't push it. When Wolfe starts brooding, you let the volcano cool before poking it. Still, I couldn't shake his tone. It wasn't philosophy. It was a prediction, and Wolfe's predictions tend to come with body counts. By the time we reached the brownstone, I was half convinced guilt wasn't the only thing about to die. The next morning, the Gazette hit the stoop before breakfast. I opened it while Fritz was still setting the tray. The headline took my appetite and ran off with it. Dr. Gerald Miles found dead. Noted psychologist dies overnight. Natural causes, said the report. Heart failure. Peaceful, tidy, dull. I carried it into the office. Wolfe was already at his desk, scowling at correspondence. I dropped the paper in front of him. He read the headline once, then leaned back. "Heart failure," he murmured. "How predictable." I said, "You called it, remember? The dangerous kind." He didn't answer, just rang for Fritz and ordered more beer than usual, for breakfast. And I, being the sentimental type, started a new case file. The man without guilt. I had the uncomfortable feeling it was going to fill up fast. It was one of those mornings when the house could have been run by clockwork. Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids, Fritz was in the kitchen humming something operatic, and I was staring at the typewriter like it owed me rent. Then came the knock. 3 calm, measured taps that didn't sound like a bill collector or a cop. Fritz opened the door and ushered in a woman dressed in black, graceful, composed, and carrying an air that didn't belong to grief alone. Wolfe's eyebrows lifted a fraction when she entered the office, which in his world counts as astonishment. "Mrs. Gerald Miles," she said quietly. That name got a reaction. Wolfe's hand, halfway to his beer, froze mid-air. Mine didn't. I poured myself a coffee and waited. She looked around the room like she was appraising the moral temperature. Trouble had walked in, polite, perfumed, and already in charge. Mrs. Miles took a seat with the kind of poise that comes from breeding, or practice. She wasn't the weepy kind of widow. If she'd brought a lace handkerchief, it was for decoration. My husband's death, she began, was not natural. It was murder. Wolfe sighed, which for him was an opening remark. The medical report disagrees. I expected it would, she said smoothly. He was killed by one of his own patients, one of the men he called his guiltless ones. That got me. Your husband ran a club for sociopaths. Her eyes flicked toward me, calm and steady. He studied them. He said they were incapable of remorse, true sociopaths. But one of them was capable of more. Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled. And you, madam, have proof. Only intuition, she replied. And the fact that the list he kept, his private record of those men, has disappeared. I couldn't decide if she was sincere or rehearsed. Either way, she had the floor, and Wolfe was listening. Mrs. Miles reached into her handbag and took out a folded page, a photocopy of her husband's letterhead, empty except for a typed line at the top. The guiltless. He kept the names locked in his study, she said. I searched. The file was gone. Presumably, Wolfe murmured, the police did not consider that significant. They didn't even ask. They were eager to call it natural. Her calm was impressive. She spoke of her husband's work as though discussing an unpleasant experiment in another department. Wolfe frowned, studying her the way he studies a new dish Fritz proposes to serve. And these men, he asked, were his patients? Yes, influential men, wealthy, dangerous. That last word hung in the air. I had the feeling she'd come to us because the police couldn't afford to touch whoever was on that list. Very well, Wolfe said finally. Continue. When Wolfe stops pretending boredom, it means he's thinking, and thinking means the hook is in. But just as she leaned forward, Wolfe snapped upright in his chair. Pfui, madam, your premise offends logic. She blinked. Offends? He waved a hand. This notion of men without guilt is psychological drivel. Murder requires motive, not diagnosis. An absence of conscience may explain appetite, but not choice. I grinned. Translation, he doesn't buy it. Wolfe glared at me, then turned back to her. I declined to chase shadows formed by medical euphemism. Mrs. Miles didn't flinch. Then you decline justice. That landed hard enough to silence the room. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, and for once, he didn't have an immediate retort. I knew that tone. It meant she'd just cracked his shell, and he didn't like the draft. She stood, calm as ever. Thank you for your time, Mr. Wolfe. But she wasn't halfway to the door before I saw it. Wolfe's lips tightening. He hated being dismissed. When she reached the threshold, I beat Wolfe to it. Hold it, Mrs. Miles. Don't rush your exit. He doesn't say it, but the word drivel in this office is often followed by a bill. She smiled faintly. I'm aware of Mr. Wolfe's reputation. Out came a slim checkbook. Black leather, initials in gold. She wrote a figure that could have funded Fritz's kitchen for a year and slid it across Wolfe's desk. Wolfe didn't touch it at first. He looked at it the way a man looks at a wasp on his napkin. Then he sighed. Very well. I will consider the matter. I grinned. Which means you just got yourself a detective. Her eyes softened for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. When the door closed behind her, I turned to Wolfe. Psychological drivel, huh? He glared. Archie, please, never interrupt a man negotiating with his own hypocrisy. It wasn't the first time money had improved Wolfe's intellectual curiosity. My next stop was Dr. Miles's office. The late doctor's assistant, Alan Dean, opened the door. Young, nervous, with the smile of a man trying to convince himself everything's fine. I'm just tidying things up, he said too quickly. Dr. Miles's death was sudden, but peaceful. Sure, I said. Heart failure. Instant classic. He nodded, eyes darting everywhere except mine. His hands trembled while he stacked papers that didn't need stacking. I asked a few friendly questions. He answered none of them cleanly. Finally, I said, You don't look like a man who believes in peaceful deaths. His face tightened. You shouldn't be here. Maybe he was right, but he didn't sound like a man protecting privacy. He sounded like someone guarding fear. By the time I left, I knew two things. Alan Dean was hiding something, and I'd be back before his nerves recovered. On my way back, I bumped into Caroline Vance, the same reporter who'd grilled Miles at the lecture. She looked like she'd been waiting for me. "Still following the good doctor's ghost?" she asked. "Strictly for professional amusement," I said. "Why? You got something?" She tapped her notebook. "The coroner's report. Some timings don't add up. The body was found hours before they claim he died." "Nice trick," I said. "Dead before death. That'll sell papers." She smiled. "It'll sell more when I find out why." She turned away, leaving a whiff of perfume and suspicion. Caroline wasn't chasing headlines. She was chasing something personal. And if there's one thing Wolfe can't stand, it's someone chasing the same thing he is. I decided to keep that detail to myself, at least until Wolfe's mood could handle competition. That evening I went back to Miles's office for another look. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that warns you to tread light. The door had been forced open. Inside, the place looked like a tornado had manners. Drawers yanked out, files scattered, nothing broken without purpose. I stepped in and heard a creak, then a shadow moved. "Hold it," I said sharply. The shadow didn't. It bolted through the back exit before I could get a good look. I checked the desk. Empty. No list. No notes. No hint of the doctor's guiltless men. But on the floor, under the overturned chair, a scrap of paper caught my eye. Half a page, torn clean through the word Miles. Somebody was making sure the good doctor stayed dead in every sense of the word. And now, they knew I was looking for what they'd already stolen. If tailing Alan Dean had been a sport, I'd have placed somewhere between amateur and saint. The man couldn't have looked guiltier if he'd been wearing a striped suit and a ball and chain accessory. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if his conscience were jogging behind him. He darted through midtown traffic, nearly got clipped by a taxi, and finally ducked into a marble front office building that could have passed for a bank, or a confession booth for millionaires. The brass plate read, "Rostand and Weaver, attorneys at law." From the looks of it, they handled the kind of clients who didn't sign checks. They signed immunity deals. I loitered long enough to watch him disappear inside, still wringing his hands like they were auditioning for sainthood. I didn't need Wolfe's vocabulary to name it. Fear. And if Alan Dean was that scared, it wasn't of the cops. It was of something or someone who didn't mind removing witnesses before dessert. The next morning, I dropped by the same address pretending to deliver legal documents. It wasn't much of a disguise, but the receptionist took one look at my tie and decided I was harmless. That'll be the day. Philip Rostand's office was the kind of place that made you want to whisper apologies to the carpet. He rose from behind his desk, immaculate and sleek, all handshake and toothpaste smile. "Mr. Goodwin, isn't it?" he said, as if my name had been printed on a wanted poster. "That's right," I said. "I hear you knew Dr. Miles." "Casually," he replied. "A man of intellect and peculiar taste in acquaintances." He said it with the delicacy of a man handling crystal and the insincerity of a preacher taking bribes. His handshake was soft, careful, and meaningless. When I left, I had no evidence, no confession, but a gut feeling that Rostand didn't use silk gloves to keep his hands clean. He used them to hide what he'd already touched. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was communing with beer and orchids, which meant he wasn't taking visitors, not even me. So I found Saul Panzer instead. He showed up an hour later, smelling faintly of cold air and competence. Saul never wastes words. "Rostand's firm," he said, "handles settlements for 3 of Miles's old patients, all confidential, big money, all paid through shell corporations." "Money laundering?" I asked. More like moral laundering, Saul replied, deadpan. I liked that. I paid him and passed the news to Wolfe. The big man didn't blink, but I saw his eyes sharpen. The guiltless, he said, are never destitute. Vice, it seems, is lucrative. I didn't argue. When Wolfe starts quoting morality, you just nod and make sure the check clears. Still, something about the phrase moral laundering clung to me. It sounded like a service Miles's patients might have paid well for, especially if their consciences were in storage. After dinner, Fritz had made sauerbraten that could have converted an atheist. Wolfe called me into the office. He'd cleared the blotter and was drawing geometric shapes on a pad, which is always bad news for the guilty. Observe, Archie, he said. A triangle, 3 vertices, Miles the physician, Rostan the lawyer, and the patients, the so-called guiltless men. I leaned on the desk. Look solid. Precisely. Remove one vertex and the structure collapses. I gave him a look. You mean like a stool missing a leg, or a racket missing a sucker? He grunted. Both analogies suffice. His forefinger tapped the point labelled Rostand. This one, I suspect, is the fulcrum. He balanced their misdeeds, profited from their secrets, and now he trembles. Then we're back to motive, I said. Not yet, Wolfe murmured. First, confirmation. When Wolfe says confirmation, it usually means I get to run errands that end in bruises. Just as Wolfe was reaching for another beer, the doorbell announced a natural disaster. Fritz opened the door and stomped Inspector Kramer, dripping sarcasm and precinct sweat in equal measure. Good evening, Wolfe said dryly. I hope you brought no mud from the gutter. Kramer ignored it. You're meddling again, Wolfe. I've got widows calling the press, lawyers calling the commissioner, and your name's floating around like a bad penny. I said, you forgot the part where we get medals. He swung a glare my way. I could give you one, engraved on a cell door. Wolfe's lip curled. You have no jurisdiction over intellect, Inspector. What I've got is a case you're poisoning. Then I suggest inoculation, Wolfe said and leaned back. It went downhill from there. When those two spar, words fly like bullets and about as politely. By the time Kramer left, the air smelled of burnt ego and tobacco, and Wolfe was smiling faintly, always a bad sign for someone. After the door slammed, I decided to test the tension. Maybe you just don't like dead men who can't confess, I told Kramer's retreating back. He turned, growled something unprintable, and clomped off like a freight train with bad brakes. Wolfe exhaled heavily. Archie, must you always provoke the police? Sure, I said. It keeps me limber. He scowled. Your tongue is limber enough to hang you someday. Only if Kramer ties the knot, I said, which didn't improve his mood. Still, under the irritation, Wolfe was energized. The kind of energy that meant he smelled blood, figuratively, so far. He closed his eyes, fingers steepled. Kramer believes he is dealing with corruption. He is not. He is dealing with contagion. I opened my mouth to ask what kind, but he waved me silent. When Wolfe starts using medical metaphors, I know better than to interrupt the diagnosis. When Kramer's echoes had died out, Wolfe sat very still. Then he said, almost to himself, Miles's patients were not cured of guilt. They were cured of the capacity for it. That's poetic, I said. And creepy, he continued. Imagine a mind unburdened by conscience, free of restraint, remorse, or responsibility. A man thus liberated is not healed. He is loosed. Yeah, I said, and usually armed. He ignored me. Miles thought he was studying pathology. He was cultivating it. That did it. I felt the chill. Wolfe wasn't speculating. He was describing. If you're right, I said, then one of these guilt-free wonders killed Miles, and we're next on the guest list. He gave me a look that could have iced beer. Archie, your dramatics are tedious. No one will kill us. Maybe not. But I noticed he didn't sound entirely convinced. It was close to midnight when I shut off the lights and headed upstairs. That's when I saw it. An envelope slipped under the door. No stamp, no name, just paper. Inside, a single line, typed cleanly. Stop looking for guilt in men who have none, or you'll find your own. I stared at it for a long second, then at the door. The street outside was silent, too silent for New York. Wolfe was still awake, so I handed him the note. He read it once, lips tightening. A vulgar attempt at intimidation. Effective, though, I said. I'm feeling intimidated already. He tossed it onto the desk. Archie, lock the door. Whoever delivered this prefers anonymity. Let us not indulge his courage by leaving an opening. I did as told. But even after I killed the light, the words on that note stayed in my head. And for the first time in weeks, I wished Wolfe wasn't right so often. Caroline Vance called mid-morning, which was already a bad sign. She had the kind of voice that made a man expect either a lawsuit or an adventure. Goodwin, she said, bring your charm and your shoes to 45th Street. I've got something worth Wolfe's eyebrows. That was bait, and she knew it. Wolfe's eyebrows don't move for less than murder or mustard. I asked what kind of something, but she only laughed. You'll see, she said, and hung up. Wolfe was upstairs with the orchids, communing with nature's more tolerable specimens. I left him to it. If Caroline had something that could raise Wolfe's eyebrows, I wanted front row seats. I didn't tell Fritz where I was going. He'd only warned me to take a sandwich. I just grabbed my hat and headed out, feeling like I was walking straight into somebody else's headline. The studio was one of those midtown spots where art and ego share rent. A bright sign read, Hewson Portraits, timeless character in modern light. Inside, a dozen. People stood around pretending not to be impressed with themselves. Caroline was there, camera in hand, looking more like she owned the place than the man behind the lens. Archie, she said, meet Dr. Miles's patients, or what's left of them. She wasn't exaggerating. I recognized a few names from the files. Men and women Miles had supposedly cured of guilt. Ray Harlan, the sculptor with a temper. Elliot Brand, a corporate operator whose smile belonged in evidence. And June Latham, the philanthropist whose money washed cleaner than soap. Caroline explained the setup. A memorial portrait series of Miles's success stories. I called it macabre. She called it journalism. The air smelled like perfume and pretension. Every face in that room looked polished and guilty enough to blind a mirror. Ray Harlan was working the room like a man who'd been acquitted twice and wanted extra credit. Broad shoulders, restless hands, and a grin that didn't match his eyes. Archie Goodwin, he said when Caroline introduced me, the famous watchdog. Depends who's doing the barking, I said. He laughed, then held up a clay figurine of a woman's face, frozen mid-laughter. Miles thought guilt was a disease. I think it's art. You capture it, you own it. Caroline aimed her camera. Smile, Ray. He did. A small, mocking smile that didn't reach the corners. Let's capture life, he said, before it fades. The shutter clicked. The sound echoed like a warning. He looked around at the others and added, the doctor would have liked that line. He was wrong. Miles would have hated it, but he wasn't around to say so. The next shot was supposed to be routine. The photographer adjusted his tripod. Someone dimmed the lights, and Caroline called for another pose. Then the flash went off. Too bright, too hot, and chaos snapped to life. Ray Harlan gasped mid-laugh, staggered, and collapsed. One moment he was grinning. The next he was convulsing on the floor, hands clawing at his throat. For a second, nobody moved. Then the screaming started. Caroline dropped her camera, cursing under her breath. I knelt beside Harlan, but he was gone. Eyes open, mouth frozen in that final ghastly grin. Someone shouted for a doctor, which was poetic, since the only one who might have explained it was already buried. I glanced at the flashbulb. It smoked faintly, releasing a sharp chemical stink that didn't belong in photography. I didn't need Wolfe to tell me what it meant. The man hadn't been framed. He'd been delivered. Kramer showed up before the body cooled, trailing uniforms and bad temper. He looked at me and didn't bother hiding his disgust. "Goodwin," he growled. "Why is it you turn up where decent people drop dead?" "I'm broad-minded," I said. "I go where the story is." He scowled. "You're not press." "Close enough," I said. "I work for someone who reads the papers before they're printed." That didn't improve his mood. He stomped around barking at photographers and witnesses like he was auditioning for a kennel. Caroline tried to explain, but Kramer had all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. I stayed out of his way, mostly. He finally jabbed a finger at me. "Tell Wolfe I'm sick of his interference, and yours." "Tell him yourself," I said. "He loves visitors." That earned me a glare capable of melting film. But I'd already decided this wasn't the kind of scene you argue your way out of. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the full account, complete with Kramer's poetry. He listened, eyes half shut, drumming fingers on the armrest. "Poison," he said finally. "Delivered by flash powder, you suspect?" "Looks that way." He nodded once. Ingenious and theatrical. Characteristics of vanity, not necessity. "Then come see the set," I said. "They've got the props, the suspects, and Kramer's dance routine." Wolfe groaned. "If I desired chaos, Archie, I'd attend the legislature." That was a no. He leaned back, reached for his beer, and added, "Bring me the statements. I shall distill truth from noise. You'll miss all the fun." "Fun," he said, "is for the witless." He took a long drink. I went to fetch my coat. It wasn't that I enjoyed crime scenes. I just liked watching Wolfe pretend he didn't. I collected the testimonies that evening, and they read like a chorus of liars auditioning for sainthood. Elliot Brand swore he'd seen nothing unusual, which was typical of men who notice everything. June Latham trembled prettily, murmuring that the Lord tests us through tragedy. I suggested he try postcards instead. The photographer, Hewson, insisted the flash powder was standard stock. "Except," he added nervously, "someone tampered with it earlier this week. The jar looked off." Kramer overheard and pounced. "Who?" Hewson paled. "Anyone could have touched it. Miles's people came by for sittings." Kramer grunted, jotting notes he wouldn't read. I left before he could recruit me as a suspect. The studio still reeked of chemicals and fear. One of the assistants was sweeping up shattered glass, and I noticed the spot where Harlan fell. Clean already. Too clean. Someone wanted this scene erased, one sweep at a time. The next morning, Caroline called again. "Archie," she said, voice tight. "You'd better come back to the studio. There's something wrong with the negatives." When I arrived, Hewson was pale as a ghost behind his drying racks. "I swear I didn't touch it," he muttered. He pointed to one of the plates. The image had developed overnight. It wasn't Ray Harlan or June Latham or any of the living subjects. It was Dr. Gerald Miles, clear as daylight, seated in a chair, looking straight into the lens, and smiling. I stared. "You're telling me that was taken yesterday?" Caroline nodded. "After Harlan died." The room was silent except for the drip of rinse water. I said, "Either ghosts have started modelling, or somebody wants us to believe they do." But even as I said it, the back of my neck prickled. Because the smile on that dead man's face wasn't posed. It was waiting. Saul Panzer and I spent 2 days tracing Ray Harlan's last movements, which was like following a rumour through fog. The sculptor had lived large, owed larger, and flirted with anyone who owned a checkbook. His creditors spoke fondly of his artistic temperament, meaning he didn't pay his bills. One art dealer remembered him showing up 3 nights before he died, demanding cash for a piece in progress. The only progress was in his debts. A gallery girl claimed he'd been drinking with a lady benefactor, though her memory stopped right before names. Saul took notes the way a surgeon handles scalpels, clean and quiet. "He was scared," he said. "Sure," I replied, "of the same thing that killed him. We didn't know what that was yet, but every trail ended at the same address, Ralston's law firm. And nothing makes an honest man sweat like finding a lawyer where his conscience used to be. Wolfe sent me to dig into Ralston's books, not literally, though I considered bringing a shovel. Lawyers' ledgers are built to repel daylight, but I had Saul. He found what accountants call irregularities and what I call smoking guns wrapped in red tape. Harlin had made regular payments to a shell company, $3,000 here, $5,000 there, channeled through Ralston's firm. On paper, it was consulting. In reality, it smelled like blackmail. When I brought the report home, Wolfe skimmed it once and said, "The man was paying for silence." "Whose?" I asked. "Possibly his own." He set the paper down, sighed, and closed his eyes. "It is a simple pattern, Archie. The doctor studied corruption, the lawyer monetized it, and the patients paid for their freedom from guilt." "Expensive therapy," I said. Wolfe nodded. "And unsustainable. The currency of guilt, once spent, is irrecoverable." I didn't argue. You don't heckle a philosopher who can invoice. June Latham answered the door in pearls and perfume, the kind of woman who could make sincerity look rehearsed. She offered me tea. I asked for information. She gave me both, lukewarm and sweet. "Poor Ray," she sighed. "He was brilliant, but troubled. He wanted so much from life." "From you too, apparently," I said. "He told friends you modelled for him, after hours." Her smile flickered. "Art requires dedication." "Sure," I said. "So does alibis." She put down her cup with care. "Detective work must be exhausting, Mr. Goodwin." "It's like sculpture," I said. "You chip away till you find the shape underneath." When I left, her charm followed me to the elevator like static electricity. I didn't know if she was lying, but I knew she'd practiced. And I'd bet my next paycheck she wasn't done playing innocent. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, with a newspaper spread like a crime scene. Caroline Vance had done it again. Her front-page column, titled "The Man Without Guilt," read like a sermon with claws. She painted Dr. Miles as a manipulative puppet master who fed on his patients' weaknesses. If she'd used more adjectives, she could have buried him twice. I read it out loud while Wolfe buttered his toast. He didn't interrupt until I hit the paragraph about therapeutic deception. "She writes with skill," he admitted, "and the irresponsibility of a saboteur." "She's got the city talking," I said. "Miles looks like a mad scientist. Lydia's getting hate mail. Kramer's getting ulcers." Wolfe grunted. "The woman wields her pen as a blade. A pity she cuts indiscriminately." He folded the paper and closed his eyes, but I could see the irritation under his calm. Wolfe doesn't mind publicity. He minds inaccuracy. I asked, "You want me to tell her to cool it?" "No. Let the fire burn," he said quietly. "It may reveal what hides in the ashes." The first call came just past midnight. Lydia Miles's voice was brittle as frost. "Mr. Goodwin, someone called again. They said if I don't stop defending Gerald's memory, I'll join him." "Did they name themselves?" "No, but they knew my address." I told her to lock the doors and hang up if they called again. Afterward, I went to the kitchen for coffee and found Fritz polishing silver like it was therapy. "Bad news?" he asked. "Just the usual bedtime story," I said. Even Fritz looked shaken. "She is alone." "Yeah, and somebody wants to keep her that way." When I told Wolfe, he merely nodded. "Fear is the inevitable companion of guilt, Archie. The question is whose." He didn't elaborate. He just rang for beer. I took that as his version of sympathy. But later, when the house got quiet, I wondered how many more calls Lydia would get, and how many would come for us next. By noon the next day, Wolfe hadn't eaten. That alone was grounds for an obituary. Fritz hovered, clutching a tray of lamb chops like a nurse with medicine. "Leave it," Wolfe said. Fritz nearly fainted. I stared. "You're fasting?" What's next? Exercise. Wolfe ignored me. Even orchids wilt when fed with poison disguised as perfume, he murmured. Meaning Caroline's article? Meaning the world at large? He leaned back, eyes half closed. Dr. Miles sowed a crop of moral anemia. His patients grew rich, immune to shame. Now the rot consumes the soil, I said. You're getting poetic again. I am getting angry, Wolfe corrected. That made two of us. Only his anger came with Latin vocabulary, and mine came with shoe leather. When Fritz finally left, Wolfe looked at me. We have permitted others to dictate the pace. No longer. Meaning. Meaning, he said. You will find Alan Dean. He has outlived his usefulness, and perhaps his life. Alan Dean didn't answer his door. The building manager said he'd checked out yesterday. No forwarding address, no farewell. That's never good news in our line of work. I jimmied the lock and stepped inside. The place looked like a robbery staged by an art critic. Drawers gutted, furniture overturned, papers ripped and scattered like confetti from a nervous breakdown. The smell of fear lingered, not fresh, but recent. On the desk lay a torn photograph, Dr. and Mrs. Miles at some charity gala, smiling like sin had been temporarily suspended. The top corner was missing, but I recognized the handwriting on the back. For AD, who knows the cost of conscience? One more detail froze me. The bottom right corner of the photo circled Wolfe's address in red pencil. I folded it carefully and left. Whoever had been here wasn't looking for souvenirs. They'd been looking for us. And that, in my book, meant the next move belonged to Wolfe. The clerk at the Westmore Hotel looked nervous enough to confess to something. But all I wanted was a key. Saul's tip said Alan Dean had checked in under an alias. When I got there, he was still registered, but not breathing. The bathroom looked like a steam bath sponsored by Homicide. Dean was in the tub, head tilted back, water still running. The glass on the sink smelled faintly of bitter almonds, which wasn't the scent of hotel soap. A note sat neatly on the counter, typed, signed, and too tidy for a man dying in panic. Forgive me, I was weak. I've seen suicides, and they never spell check. I pulled the plug, shut off the faucet, and took one last look. Whoever staged this wanted efficiency, not drama. Then I called Kramer, because if I didn't, he'd find out anyway, and prefer it less. Kramer arrived in under 20 minutes, which must have broken some personal record. He didn't bother with greetings. Goodwin, he said, if I find out you planted this stiff to make Wolfe look clever, You'll what? I asked. Outshout the autopsy? His face turned the colour of undercooked beef. You always show up where decent people die. Decent, I said. Dean worked for a man who taught psychopaths self-esteem. That didn't help. He shoved past me, barking orders to his men. When he finished, he turned back, smirking. Tell your boss this is a police matter. He's not needed. Then why are you here? He ignored that, but his jaw clenched. Kramer likes his murders simple and his suspects breathing. This one had neither. When I left, he was still fuming at the corpse. That's how I knew Wolfe would want the full report, right after lunch, beer, and the satisfaction of being right again. By the time I got back, Wolfe had already cornered the story. He was in the office, orchids exiled, notebooks open. Saul and Ori are tracing Lydia's phone calls, he said. Each originates from a relay under Rostan's control, meaning he's got her wired tighter than a jukebox. Precisely. Yet none of the calls connect to an individual. They circle back, like a snake swallowing itself. He scowled. It is not artistry, it is concealment. I told him about Dean's performance in the tub. He didn't flinch. The poison? Cyanide, likely. Kramer's boys will confirm. Then the list is now twice cursed. Lovely, I said. So what's next? Next, Wolfe said. We expect Kramer's intrusion. He will come to accuse, not to learn. He leaned back, fingers steepled. And Archie, inform Fritz to prepare dinner early. Murder and indigestion are seldom compatible. I left him to his calculations. With Wolfe, murder never waited for dessert. Kramer lived up to Wolfe's prediction. He arrived right before the soup. Fritz looked crushed. "Still eating, huh?" Kramer said, stomping in. "You've turned homicide into dinner theatre." Wolfe didn't rise. "Inspector, you persist in mistaking sustenance for spectacle. A regrettable trait. Your meddling's turning my case into a circus." "My meddling," Wolfe corrected, "compensates for municipal incompetence, which in this city, I grant, is consistent art." Kramer growled, "You think you're funny?" "I think," Wolfe said, "you're obstructing digestion." I coughed to hide a grin. Wolfe's patience with Kramer is measured in syllables. When the inspector finally stormed out, the house sighed with relief. Fritz returned with the entree, veal in cream sauce, and muttered something about uncivilized guests. Wolfe lifted his glass. "To order, Archie. Civilization depends on it." I said, "So does homicide. It's getting very well organized." He grunted. "That, alas, is the trouble." After dinner, I went through Miles's notebooks again. The handwriting looked like a spider on tranquilizers, but I'd learned to read worse. There were columns of initials, each one paired with cryptic remarks and amounts of money. I called Wolfe in. "Doctor's shorthand," I said, "or code?" He glanced once. "Not code. Protection. Each pair of initials corresponds to a client of Rostand's. Men entangled in scandal, quietly silenced." I whistled. "A directory of sin." Indeed. Miles studied corruption as a doctor studies disease, but his partner inoculated it with cash. Meaning? Miles had evidence. Rostand had profit. They shared the infection until one decided to sterilize the other. That was Wolfe's version of excitement. His eyes gleamed. "Archie, such records are perilous. Hide them well." "Better than Fritz hides dessert." "Considerably." I locked the notes in my desk drawer. When Wolfe starts using words like perilous, you make sure the gun's loaded and the curtains shut. Lydia Miles came by the next morning, pale and trembling, holding a bundle of papers. She sat like a statue carved from fear. "They were my husband's recordings," she said. "Patient sessions. He was writing a book, The Guiltless Mind. He said it would expose them all." "All who?" I asked. She swallowed. "The ones who couldn't feel guilt. He said they were spreading, infecting others." Wolfe took the papers, turning them gently. "And you concealed these?" "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. "He told me once, if anything happened to him, the truth would be in the final chapter. But it's missing." Wolfe's brow furrowed. "Madam, knowledge withheld is complicity." Tears formed, but she held them back. "I was afraid. Gerald was obsessed. He said one of his patients frightened him." "Frightened?" Wolfe repeated softly. "Fascinating." She looked up, eyes hollow. "Now he's dead, and I think the same one is coming for me." When she left, Wolfe unfolded the draft pages like sacred scripture. He read silently, lips tightening with each line. I fetched coffee and waited. Half an hour later, he exhaled. "Archie." "Yeah?" "He wrote about all his subjects, the guiltless men, but one name is conspicuously absent." "Forgotten?" "Impossible. The missing entry is deliberate. He described the man, but not his name. The patient who looks through men as if they are glass." "Sounds like Rostand," I said. "Or Brand, or any beast of self-interest," he replied. But Miles feared him. He tapped the page. "He recorded the acts of corruption but withheld the ultimate name, perhaps to negotiate with it. That was folly." I said, "So he left us with a riddle." "No, Archie, he left us with a murderer." He folded the manuscript neatly, eyes gone cold. And I knew, somewhere in that missing name, Wolfe had just found his next corpse. When Wolfe says, "Use discretion," what he means is, try not to embarrass me by dying. He was in his chair, lips pursed, orchids temporarily forgotten. The manuscript pages from Miles lay on his desk like a stack of sleeping snakes. "You will, of course," he said. "Exercise judgment." "Always," I told him, sometimes even before breakfast. He ignored that. "Find the missing name, and do so without unnecessary noise. Discretion is the armor of intelligence." "Sure," I said, "and bullets bounce right off it." He closed his eyes. "Archie, I'm entrusting you with an errand that may expose the marrow of this case. Please attempt, for once, not to be glib." That was his way of saying he was worried. When Nero Wolfe gets polite, it's the same as someone else buying life insurance. I grabbed my coat. "All right, General, I'll go hunting in enemy territory." He muttered, "Yes, Manhattan." The diner smelled like grease, loneliness, and optimism, served warm. Caroline Vance sat in a corner booth, stirring her coffee as if the answers were hiding under the cream. She looked tired. "They've been calling me," she said. "Anonymous, of course. The voice says if I don't stop digging, I'll end up like Miles." "Poison or publicity?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "I haven't decided which is worse. I ordered pie, because sugar helps with threats. You print one story, half the city goes hysterical. You print two and somebody reaches for a gun. Maybe you should take up gardening. I like dangerous hobbies. Then you're in the right crowd." She leaned in. "You think it's Rostand?" "I think," I said. "The man who calls himself civilized usually isn't." When I left her, the pie was half-eaten, the coffee untouched, and Caroline was staring at her reflection in the spoon like it might accuse her. Saul Panzer doesn't call unless he's got gold or dynamite. That night, it was both. "Archie," he said, voice low. "Rostand's not just a lawyer. He's been laundering more than reputations. I found records tying him to a sealed court file, client name redacted, charges wiped clean." "Neat job," I said. "He's the kind who sterilizes crime before breakfast." Saul gave a soft grunt. "Yeah, well, he didn't sterilize this. The record's connected to a corporation owned by Elliot Brand." "The golden boy with the diamond conscience," I said. "That's the one. Rostand buried his past, deep. Then I'll dig it up. Try not to write my obituary." Saul chuckled. "Just make it interesting." He hung up, and I stood on the curb, the city humming like a bad idea. If Rostand had been the doctor's brain, Brand was the pulse, and right now, it was beating too quietly. Elliot Brand's office suite looked like a shrine to clean living. Everything gleamed. Marble, glass, the kind of furniture that never gets sat on. His secretary smiled like she'd been trained by a diplomat and wired by the Treasury. "Mr. Brand's unavailable," she said. "I figured," I replied, "since he's busy not having a criminal record." Her smile didn't twitch, but her fingers froze on the typewriter. I left before she decided whether to faint or call security. Back in the street, I phoned Saul. "You were right," I told him. "Brand's cleaner than sin, and twice as artificial." "Then he's hiding something," Saul said. "Yeah," I said. "Probably a corpse or a conscience, whichever fits better in a drawer." The more I thought about it, the clearer it got. Brand wasn't Miles's victim or patient. He was both. And if his conscience had been erased, somebody had done the scrubbing for him. Breaking into Brand's office wasn't a challenge. It was an insult to burglars. I've seen tighter locks on lunchboxes. Inside, the place was dark and still, except for the faint smell of cigars and cash. I found the safe behind a framed stock certificate. It took 4 minutes and 2 muttered prayers to open. Inside were the usual trophies: bonds, private letters, and one neat envelope marked Dr. GM. Under it lay a small vial labelled simply M. That got my attention. Miles's private stock maybe, the same letter he'd used for his notes on the guiltless mind. I pocketed both and shut the safe. Then I heard it, the faintest creak of leather, somewhere behind me. Somebody else was in the room, breathing the same air I was trying not to. I moved fast toward the window. If I was lucky, I'd make it to the street before whoever it was decided to share their opinion. In lead. Luck's overrated. The bullet hit the glass just as I dove, showering me with shards and profanity. I hit the pavement behind a parked car, ears ringing and coat torn. Upstairs, a shadow moved across the blinds, a tall one. Then silence. No second shot. I checked my pockets, list, vial, and the unshakable feeling that my guardian angel had taken the night off. A cabbie slowed to stare, then decided I looked more like trouble than a fare. I limped 2 blocks before hailing another and told him to head for West 35th Street. As the cab pulled away, I glanced back. The building's lights flickered on one floor. Brands. Whoever had fired that bullet had time to clean up and call it an accident. I told the driver to step on it. Wolfe might call it field work, but I call it getting nearly perforated for the price of my salary. When I came through the brownstone door, Fritz nearly dropped the beer tray. "Mr. Goodwin, you look like I just met a bullet." "Yes," I said. "Don't faint." I dodged. Wolfe looked up from his desk, eyes narrowing. "Your coat is compromised." "So's my patience," I said, handing him the envelope and the vial. "You can critique my tailoring later." He opened the envelope, skimmed the list, and went still. The only sound in the room was the faint tick of the globe clock. Finally, he said, "This confirms it. Rostand and Brand shared a ledger of corruption, a record of immunity, and yet one more remains." "One more what?" "One more man without guilt." He glanced up at me. "There are 2, Archie. Miles wrote about them both." I waited, but he didn't elaborate. He simply reached for the vial, held it to the light, and murmured, "The doctor experimented on the wrong species." I said, "You mean men?" He sighed. "I mean lawyers." That was Wolfe's idea of humour. Mine was surviving the week. When Wolfe sends invitations, they're not engraved, they're baited. By 7 that evening, our office looked like the waiting room for judgment. Lydia Miles sat rigid on the red chair, her grief tailored to fit. Caroline Vance hovered near the bookshelf, pretending interest in Pliny the Elder. Elliot Brand stood by the globe, all polish and no pulse. And Philip Rostand looked like a man who'd skipped too many confessions. Inspector Kramer was the uninvited guest who came anyway. "You're staging a circus, Wolfe," he grunted. "Perhaps," Wolfe said mildly, "but I prefer my animals civilized." Fritz served coffee that could wake the dead, an unintended pun given the company. Wolfe's eyes swept the room once, calculating. "I appreciate your attendance," he said. "It is rare to assemble so many varieties of guilt under one roof." Kramer grumbled, "Get on with it." "Oh, I intend to," Wolfe said, "before someone else decides to leave us permanently." Wolfe leaned back, fingertips touching like a man conducting philosophy class instead of homicide. "Dr. Gerald Miles," he began, "believed guilt was an illness, a social relic to be discarded. He cured his patients of remorse, convincing them that conscience was an evolutionary burden." Caroline Vance snorted. "He was right about the burden part." Wolfe ignored her. "But to remove guilt is to remove restraint. A man without it may commit evil not for gain or vengeance, but because it amuses him." Brand shifted in his seat. Lydia's gloved hands tightened. Rostand's eyes stayed fixed on the carpet. Wolfe continued, voice smooth as silk and sharp as glass. Dr. Miles's theories were not merely written, they were embodied. His pupils lived by them, and one, inevitably, tested them. He paused. That experiment, ladies and gentlemen, resulted in murder. Even Kramer stayed quiet. The room had gone still, like the air before a storm. Wolfe's eyes moved from one face to another, dissecting them without a scalpel. "Mr. Brand," he began, "you claim to have been in Connecticut during Harlan's death, yet your car was ticketed 3 blocks from the studio." Brand flushed. "Coincidence?" "Of course," Wolfe said blandly. "As coincidental as Mrs. Miles's missing emeralds, pawned by a man using her late husband's initials." Lydia gasped. "That's absurd." "Not at all. The receipt bears your handwriting. she wilted. Rostand cleared his throat. This is outrageous. Indeed, Wolfe agreed. Especially since your firm paid Harlan $5,000 2 days before he died. A curious retainer for a sculptor, unless he was shaping silence. Kramer's eyebrows rose. You've got proof? I have logic, Wolfe said. And logic, Inspector, is infinitely more punctual. The silence afterward could have curdled Fritz's cream. Wolfe folded his hands. We proceed. Wolfe's next act would have made Machiavelli proud. He took a folded envelope from his desk drawer and set it beside the globe. This arrived, anonymously, he said. It predicts a third murder, within 24 hours. Lydia gasped. Caroline muttered something impolite. Kramer barked, Another stunt. Not mine, Wolfe said calmly. But it serves our purpose. He turned to me. Archie, you will deliver this letter to the post office personally. Make certain eyes observe you doing so. Eyes belonging to? I asked. He gave me the look reserved for rhetorical questions. So I left, walked 2 blocks, mailed the empty envelope, and came back. When I re-entered, Wolfe was explaining moral entropy as if hosting a lecture at Columbia. The suspects fidgeted. Kramer looked ready to explode. Wolfe's tone never changed. Sometimes one must simulate danger to reveal it. And somewhere between his words, a clock began ticking toward panic. If tension had weight, the brownstone would have collapsed under it. Wolfe poured beer with the precision of a chemist, ignoring the human volcano around him. Brand lit a cigarette and missed his mouth. Lydia's eyes darted from Wolfe to the door. Caroline scribbled in her notebook like a reporter covering her own obituary. Who, she asked finally, is supposed to die this time? Wolfe took a sip. Whoever lacks the patience to wait. Kramer snorted. You're bluffing. Possibly, Wolfe said. But bluffing requires opponents. Then it happened. A subtle movement near the hallway. Rostand shifted in his chair, hand brushing his pocket. Fritz appeared from the kitchen doorway, face pale. For a moment, everyone breathed the same heavy air. Wolfe set down his glass. Archie, he said softly, our guest has decided to depart prematurely. That was my cue. Philip Rostand shot up like a man remembering a forgotten appointment with eternity. He mumbled something about urgent business and lunged for the door. Mr. Rostand, Wolfe said coolly, sit. He didn't. By the time Fritz stepped aside, Rostand was halfway down the hall, knocking over a coat rack on the way out. I followed, but Saul Panzer was already waiting outside, leaning against the stoop rail like a quiet piece of fate. Rostand hit him full speed. Saul sidestepped, caught him by the arm, and twisted. It wasn't violent, just efficient. The man folded like bad origami. When I brought him back in, Kramer was muttering, What the hell? Saul handed Wolfe a small folded note he'd pulled from Rostand's pocket. Wolfe read it once, then laid it on the desk. A confession in miniature, he said. Rostand planned to flee, before his own trap snapped. The lawyer's silence was eloquent enough to incriminate a saint. Rostand didn't bother denying it. Under Kramer's glare and Wolfe's stillness, he cracked fast. The words came out in gasps. Blackmail, stolen files, Miles's death by poison meant to silence a potential scandal. He admitted to paying Harlan for the list, killing Dean for his curiosity, and nearly adding Lydia Miles to the total for sentimentality's sake. When he finished, the room was heavy with it, the stink of guiltless greed. Kramer cuffed him without comment. Caroline folded her notebook shut. Lydia stared at Wolfe as if he'd conjured damnation. Wolfe leaned back, eyes on the lawyer. You were a man without guilt, Mr. Rostand. You proved the doctor's thesis more effectively than he ever dreamed. Rostand snarled, You're no better. You enjoy it. Wolfe's reply was soft. No, sir. I endure it. After Kramer hauled him out, Wolfe sat in silence, then finally said, There is no victory in dissecting rot. I poured him a fresh beer. Maybe not, I said, but it's still good surgery. He almost smiled. Almost. Wolfe began the way he always does, by rearranging facts like a man pruning orchids. The room was still thick with Rostan's confession when he cleared his throat and said, "We shall have clarity." He laid it out in his steady, deliberate way. How Rostan poisoned Dr. Miles to seize his files, then killed Harlin when blackmail turned inconvenient, and finally silenced Dean when the assistant's conscience began to sprout inconvenient roots. Their crimes, he said, were not of passion, but principle. Each acted without guilt, an experiment that ended, predictably, in decay. Kramer grunted. Caroline scribbled furiously. Lydia Miles stared at the rug like it might swallow her memories. Wolfe folded his hands. Dr. Miles sought to prove that morality was a fiction. His disciples proved him correct, by dying for it. Nobody spoke. The truth sat there, cold and finished, like the last course of a meal you didn't order. Lydia Miles rose, slow and trembling, as if the air itself weighed too much. "I knew," she said quietly, "about Rostand. Gerald told me he was afraid of one man, his favorite patient." She looked at Wolfe, eyes brittle but dry. "I thought he meant fear in the psychological sense. He said the man felt nothing. No guilt, no empathy. I thought it was theory, not warning." Kramer shifted. "You're saying you knew Rostand had motive and kept quiet?" She nodded. "I was terrified. Gerald's obsession with guilt destroyed him, and I let it." Wolfe's tone softened only slightly. "Madam, guilt when acknowledged redeems. When ignored, it rots." She pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "Then I am both redeemed and rotten." That silenced even Kramer. Wolfe said nothing more. He simply turned his head away, as if granting her the dignity of collapse. When Lydia left, Kramer hovered by Wolfe's desk, scratching his neck like he'd found a rash called decency. "You know, Wolfe," he muttered, "you're a pain in the neck, but you cracked it clean." Wolfe, without rising, murmured, "Inspector, flattery ill suits you." "It wasn't flattery," Kramer said. "It was indigestion." He extended a hand, calloused, reluctant, and genuine. Wolfe regarded it as if it were a live grenade. "I prefer my gratitude verbal, not tactile," he said. Kramer scowled, withdrawing it. "You'd make a lousy human being if you weren't already a genius." "Fortunately," Wolfe said, "those conditions are mutually exclusive." I walked him to the door. "Don't worry," I told Kramer. "He shakes hands only when someone dies twice." He grunted. "Then maybe I'll try again next case." The door closed, and peace, or Wolfe's version of it, crept back into the room. Fritz appeared like a priest bearing absolution, sauerbraten, red cabbage, and enough beer to drown remorse. Wolfe exhaled deeply, the way most men pray. He poured himself a glass and raised it slightly. "To guilt," he said, "the one emotion that keeps civilization fed." Fritz blinked. "Fed, sir?" "Indeed. Without remorse, there would be no restraint. Without restraint, no law. Without law, no peace. Ergo, guilt is the true sustenance of society," I said. "You might put Hallmark out of business with lines like that." He ignored me, cut his meat with ceremonial care, and took a bite. The silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was earned. When he finally spoke again, it was almost gentle. "Archie, the case has concluded. Humanity, alas, continues." That was my cue to clear the dishes and not the philosophy. Later that night, I sat at my desk, finishing the paperwork and trying not to think about Lydia's face when Wolfe called guilt a gift. The house was quiet, except for the faint clink of Wolfe's beer glass upstairs and the hum of Fritz cleaning in the kitchen. I figured civilization was safe for another evening. I thought about Miles, the doctor who'd tried to erase guilt like bad handwriting, and about Rostand, who'd lived without it and ended up choking on his own immunity. Wolfe had called it decay. I called it justice, though not the kind you can write on a warrant. Wolfe once said guilt is a weakness, Maybe he's right. But I've seen what happens when people don't have it, and it makes weakness look like virtue. I turned off the lamp. If Wolfe ever decides to give another lecture on the moral condition of man, I'm staying home, with a beer, and maybe a little guilt of my own. Justice, when it finally came, felt less like thunder and more like a sigh. Wolfe said little, but his silence was heavier than any verdict. The house was still, the kind of stillness that follows revelation, not peace. Outside, the city kept moving, untroubled by the fact that one more man without guilt had met his end. Perhaps that was the real lesson. That guilt, for all its weight, is the only proof we still feel the pull of what's right. What do you think? Does conscience save us, or simply make our fall more painful? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.